Yeah. So I made a terrible mistake. I decided to follow YouTube's advice from the research tab, which is a thing you get if you're a creator on YouTube, and made a tongue-in-cheek short about the Crusades. And I did this mostly because to me the question of were the Crusades justified is one that's trivially easy to answer and understand. The answer's no, by the way, and it's still no. The reason I did that was because I thought it'd be funny to do that as a channel with the word Crusader in the handle. That being said, I did kind of dangle some bait in front of some people, and there were definitely some of them who couldn't resist. But what struck me from some of the responses I got was it was either, nuh-uh, you're wrong, which, fine, whatever. You can that's essentially fine and not worth commenting on. Or people comparing the Crusades to World War II. And yes, that is a real comment I got. And yes, we are going to talk about that. Because that is a pretty bold comparison given, everything about World War II. What I wanted to do initially in this video was expand on my thoughts a little bit. Like, it's one thing for me to just do a short where I say, this is obvious, why are we even talking about it? It's another for me to actually try and explain myself. But over the course of writing and planning this video, I came up with maybe a more interesting question, which is, why do some people want the Crusades to be justified? And things like, what is a crusade? What do we mean by the term? Because it could mean an awful lot of things, and do the answers to those questions tell us anything interesting? This is a half and half kind of video. Yeah, there's going to be a bit of history, but it's not a history video. But I am going to try and do my best to point you in the direction of sources when I talk about it. There's also going to be a bit of me exploring whether I think a common claim about people who want to justify the Crusades is true, which is that the minimization of the Crusades and of Crusader atrocities is a significant component in contemporary Islamophobia, which I will confess to coming into this not entirely convinced of it. I believed it was comorbid, but I didn't think it was like a direct line, a causal link, if you like. When I thought about it and reflected on the way that some people respond to the question of justification, I think there is a thread to pull at, so why not pull at it and see what happens? God, the comments on this are going to be so normal. But if you do want to be normal in the comments, there's a comment section for that. You should like, subscribe. We didn't reach the goal that I had to reach before my birthday, but the second best time to reach 1,500 subscribers is right now. So hit the subscribe button if you're new. But with that, let's try and figure this out. Let's unpack it a bit. When I say the Crusades to you, what comes to mind? If you like mid-2000s films, you probably think of Kingdom of Heaven, which has all the classics of the Crusades as a typical European might imagine it. Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, Saladin, the word Saracen being thrown around. It's a pretty good film, actually, and the exchange between Balian and Saladin as the Crusaders surrender Jerusalem is so good that I'm just gonna cut to it right now in some way, and we'll just enjoy it for a second.
What is Jerusalem worth?
Nothing. Everything.
If you're a gamer, you might associate it with games like Medieval 2 Total War, which has an extremely rudimentary crusade mechanic, and the game that this channel derives its name from, Crusader Kings 2 and later 3, these games, within the confines of their mechanical limitations, do offer a slightly, and I would argue, accurate dynamic with the Crusades in their games. Like, in Medieval 2 Total War, when I was a kid playing it, cities like Vilnius were valid targets for the Crusades, and let me tell you, that confused me to some extent. Confuses me a lot less now, but it was still something that confused me as a child because I imagined the Crusades the way that European adults seem to imagine it. Sorry, that was an unfair drive-by on European adults. I will get back to the topic at hand. In Crusader Kings 3, Crusades can be triggered by, and I'm not making this up, this is an actual playthrough I did, the Pechenegs, who in the start date of 1066 are Tengriist, owning land in Hungary. And I guess that means Hungary is like essential core Catholic territory, but it's whatever. Mostly, though, these mechanics tend to focus on Jerusalem, Accra, Edessa, sometimes Egypt, the places you would associate with the Crusades. If you take the first Assassin's Creed game, which takes place during the Third Crusades, the locations are Jerusalem, Damascus, and Accra. Also Masyaf, but that's a whole other thing that we do not need to get into right now. My point is that you most likely imagine Crusade to mean some kind of military campaign by Christians in the Holy Land or adjacent to the Holy Land, directed against Muslim political entities. You're not wrong if you think that. I don't want you thinking that I think you're some kind of historical illiterate if you think that. It definitely covers that. It's definitely a term that has that under its umbrella. It's just that we associate the Crusades with these locations and these peoples when you could just as easily associate Crusades with Vilnius and Baltic pagans, or Varna and the Ottoman Empire, or the Cathars in southern France. Each of these places and groups had some kind of crusades happen to or in them. That is a military campaign sanctioned by a Catholic Pope, which I know saying Catholic Pope feels like I'm being overly specific, but there are other popes that are not Catholic. Just that's why I said it like that. I know the Pope's Catholic, it's fine. I use that definition because if you Google Crusade definition, you get one that refers only to the Crusades that targeted the Holy Land, and also apparently vigorous campaign for political, social, or religious change, which, less overtly awful, I suppose, than the actual Crusades, so that's fine. If that's kind of what Crusade is meant to imply in my channel name, I guess, so ain't got the problem with it. I'll get to why I want you to come into this video aware of that broader definition in a bit, but for now, I actually do think for our purposes, this definition focused on the Holy Land and on a Catholic-Muslim conflict is going to be the one that we lean on the most. I do actually want to go into a little bit more detail on what the theory of crusading actually meant, but just understand that the simpler definition is the one that's most relevant. It's the one that's most relevant to what we're talking about. And so when I say the Crusades through this, I am largely going to mean that, but I am aware that the term means more things. Obviously, I just wanted to, I guess, show off that I knew that. What can you do? It's my channel. I get to show off sometimes. Christians, like Muslims and other religious groups, have sites of pilgrimage, and sometimes that means visiting a kind of nearby pilgrimage church or shrine and getting yourself a nice blessing in exchange for an offering to that church, which I would assume is usually a cash offering. I don't know. I'm not Catholic or Christian, so you can tell me, what would you offer at the shrine of SK the Crusader? Maybe a Patreon subscription. No, I hated doing that. I'm leaving it in, but I'm shaking my head so that you know I disapprove of that level of panhandling online. The cool thing about this and Christian theology is you do get to have some of your sins forgiven. If you're asking sincerely for forgiveness, that is, to grossly oversimplify, because I know it's going to be a whole thing with a bunch of complicated things going on. So let's just leave it there. And sometimes pilgrimages were for penance. You even see the current Pope using this language when he called his visit to Canada in the wake of the residential school scandals, whatever genocide-y things they were doing there, called it a pilgrimage of penance. In any case, visiting holy sites became a big deal in Christianity, as in Islam and in Judaism. Jerusalem ended up holding a particular importance. The question becomes, does this tendency towards pilgrimage, the particular importance of Jerusalem, and other considerations like the relative power of church in society, or, if you like, an abundance of third and fourth sons who were running around as knights killing people constantly, have any way of resolving each other? Do these tensions just sort of fix themselves? And cut to Pope Urban II, who we sadly cannot really enter the mind of because a lot of the primary sources appear to have been just destroyed. He got a tantalizing request for aid from the Byzantine Emperor. See, the Byzantines had had a pretty bad couple of decades. But the worst part was probably the Seljuk victory at the Battle of Malazgirt. I'm saying the Turkish name for the place because I can never pronounce the English name for this battle correctly. So that's just what we're going with. Sorry, everyone. Which led to the blinding and the death of one Byzantine emperor, the loss of an entire army, and the effective loss of Anatolia to the Seljuks. So you have a Byzantine emperor who really faces a question that all empires face eventually, which is, what do you do once you're not just declining, but you've declined? And there are a lot of different answers that have been brought up by many historic empires, and you will probably note that the lack of those empires today suggests that they eventually got the wrong answer. But you can either focus internally, make reforms, adapt to the new circumstances, and maybe your opponent's political situations will change in a way that you can take advantage of. Or, realizing that you have no chance of beating them militarily on your own, you try and find some mercenaries. There's some complications that you think might exist, like why would the Catholic Pope help an Orthodox Emperor, which, given the schism was finalized in 1055, seems relevant, but also its recency meant that there was still an actual relationship there. Pope Urban II calls for Crusades, starts preaching the doctrine of Crusades, something which combines this Christian tendency towards pilgrimage with a little bit of military action on the side. It's a great deal. You get some absolution and you get to do a bit of pilgrimaging and violence. It's all good. You know, join Christ's army, get an indulgence, see the world a little. You know, you're only here for a little while, you may as well see it. And you know, that's just kind of the usual way militaries recruit people to waste their lives fighting in random countries they have nothing to do with. Now, of course, the idea of fighting, you know, engaging in violence that would likely involve killing people in exchange for an indulgence was, probably still is, controversial given the very basic tenets of Christianity and all Abrahamic faiths. You know, thou shalt not kill and all that, right? Which leaves you with a very difficult series of circles to square, but nonetheless, people were ready to go crusading. We have an idea of what they were, so let's just get into the big question of this video right away. I want to take us back to that extremely broad definition of Crusades that includes the Northern Crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, the Crusade of Varna, and a whole lot of other things separated by time and location. I wanted you to be aware of that because even when we're talking about the Crusades that just happened in the Holy Lands, we're talking about events with lots of different political actors, groups that got involved, and motivations behind involvement, which means trying to create a coherent narrative that encompasses everything about what we commonly imagine as the Crusades, never mind all of those other things that I mentioned. It's difficult. It's difficult. At best, it's difficult, and it's definitely beyond me. But here's the good news, everyone. This video is more of a response to a type of opinion that I've observed and that I've been subjected to, which means I don't have to create the grand, perfect, unified, coherent narrative. Only tackle the specific idea that the Crusades can be considered justified, which is a massive relief for me because it definitely shortened the workload on this video. I want to prime you a little bit before we go into the details here and look at some choice comments I got on that short. But my main first response to the generalized, were the Crusades justified? Yes, they were response is, if the Crusades were so justified, why did Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI both apologize variously for violence and persecution carried out in the name of the Catholic Church? Now, they don't specifically name the Crusades, but violence and persecution carried out in the name of the Catholic Church definitely includes the Crusades in all of their forms. It seems to me that if the Crusades were not only justified, but justifiable, the Pope would just not acknowledge it, right? He just wouldn't bring it up. If your answer to the question of why would the Pope apologize for it is political considerations or something to that effect, then I want to ask you this as a follow-up. If modern popes have to take into account political considerations, might Pope Urban II or any of his predecessors or successors or subordinates of the Pope have been political actors to the same or maybe even a greater extent? Is that so absurd? But with that in mind, I'd like to present to you the first specific comment I want to draw your attention to, which says, the Crusades were driven by the desire to help liberate oppressed Christians and save them from purported atrocities and slavery, justified in my books. This is a pretty typical response to the question, were the Crusades justified? Which is someone pointing out that Christians were oppressed under the Seljuks or the Fatimids and were victims of atrocities. Though the commenter here, I think, accidentally raises a really good point. They say purported atrocities before they go on to say that the Crusades are justified to them on that basis. My question is, purported by whom? It's one thing if all the stories of atrocities committed by the Seljuks or the Fatimids or whoever else are just objective facts that we have a lot of evidence for. But these stories were largely spread at the time by people, for example, priests, who were in support of an idea of an expedition to the Holy Land. An example of this is Peter the Hermit. Now, you might not have heard of Peter the Hermit, so I'll just quickly explain. Peter the Hermit was the leader of the so-called People's Crusade, which really set the tone for the well-known Crusades generally, because it was, to put it in the mildest terms, a bit of a shit show. And I don't just mean that in the kind of boys will be boys kind of way. Like, this wasn't just 15,000 boys getting together, drinking 8 pints, and then having a hangover. I mean, things like this. Along the way, some of these crusades concluded that they might as well combat the enemies of Christ closer to home, and thus carried out terrible massacres of Rhineland Jews. Now, the People's Crusade also pillaged the countryside on their way to the Holy Land, and were also just generally a nuisance. Which, if I'm being honest, this was before modern supply logistics, so armies living off the land, while definitely terrible for the civilians and the local administration, wasn't the greatest sin they committed. I mean, the thing I mentioned earlier that I quoted is probably one of the biggest sins they committed. Eventually, after making their way to Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor hurries them along into Anatolia, where they were promptly annihilated by the Seljuks, which was an encounter that Peter the Hermit survived, rather miraculously given how many of the people following him did not survive that encounter. My point in telling you this is that we should be careful taking the words of people who were looking for an excuse for their big expedition. Yeah, like lurid tales of massacres and unfair taxes and slavery and the impediment of pilgrims makes for great propaganda. But there wasn't and isn't any real evidence that this was a systematic state-directed policy, or that the various Seljuk sultans, I think they were sultans, they might have been padishahs, but no, they were definitely sultans, condoned these things. Yes, I'm sure that they happened across an empire as vast as the Seljuks. Like, the Seljuks controlled territory from, like, Anatolia to Uzbekistan, and from Georgia to Oman. Like, yeah, there's some chance that isolated incidents definitely occurred. And the same could be said of the Fatimids, just as I'm sure they happened in France or the Christian-controlled parts of Spain. And while we're on the topic, if we want to talk about the treatment of minority religions in the Levant and compare it to Western Europe during the period of the Crusades, I would be very reluctant to do that if I were on the side of the Crusades were justified because minority religious groups were treated poorly. Like, I would be very reluctant to draw that comparison. Is the jizya tax or a poll tax imposed on non-Muslims and the status associated with that an imposition? Sure, I remember one right-wing documentary-style thing I watched years ago on YouTube, years and years ago on YouTube, where they mostly complained about the fact that minority religious groups under Islamic, political entities couldn't build a house taller than their Muslim neighbors. And I mean, that's certainly inconvenient if your neighbor is, like, really short, but it's better than, to take an example, the 1290 Edict of Expulsion, where the Kingdom of England permanently expelled its Jewish population. Like, I think if you ask the question, is the jizya tax worse or is being permanently expelled worse, I think you would have to be extremely partial to say that the jizya tax is worse. And I should offer the thought that there's a reason Maimonides, who was born in Cordoba and served Saladin and was incidentally Jewish, lived in lands governed by the Almoravids and the Ayyubids, rather than move to the Rhineland or to anywhere else in Western Europe. Like, there's a reason that happened. And that isn't even to say that there weren't ways minorities were mistreated across the Islamic world, whatever you think that is, because it was a large and diverse place, which is why I've tried to be as specific as possible when I'm talking about, places and things and people. The Taifas of southern Spain are quite literally a world away from Seljuk Anatolia, which is a world away from, Muslim communities that lived in China at the time. In the same way that I recognize that when England issued the Edict of Expulsion, this was the first permanent expulsion order by a Christian European state. It certainly set a tone. I would suggest it set a tone for future things that happened, but it's important not to oversimplify and not to generalize too much. But I will say, incidentally, there was an apology for the Edict of Expulsion from the Church of England. So that's, the one time England has ever apologized for anything it's done. I'm also aware that these events often took place decades apart. So again, creating a coherent narrative across space and time is really challenging. And I think that someone trying to create a coherent narrative of the Seljuks, Fatimids, Ayyubids, Zengids, uniquely mistreated Christian minority groups, really has to come with some pretty extraordinary evidence that it was significantly out of step with the common practice of the time in order to justify opinions like the one we're about to see, which I'm gonna leave on screen for you for a while because it's just that unbelievable. I mean, it's certainly one of the opinions of our time to say this sequence of words in a YouTube comment, and I won't read it out because I don't know that I could read it out without just screaming it into the microphone, and so I'm sparing you. Now, I'm not convinced that this person isn't trolling me, but also, if you believe that to say the Crusades weren't justified is the equivalent of saying World War II wasn't justified, like, who are you? Like, what? Really? Like, what do you think Nazi Germany's biggest crime was? And what do you think happened under the Seljuks or the Fatimids that justified the Crusades to that extent? And if you really think these things, even, like, do you really think the things that the Crusaders made up in their head are even close to morally equivalent to the things Nazi Germany did? I also just want to make the point that generally referring to Islam or Muslims is immediately a very bad generalization. And I'm going to talk more about how this links into the modern expression of all this stuff later. But there's, again, a reason I have been specific about who I'm talking about beyond it's just good practice. But back to the main point. To believe that the Crusades were as justified as World War II means you have to believe that the intervention of the various allies in World War II were motivated by the many crimes of the Nazi regime, which I think is reasonable to dispute given the Western Allies' entry upon the invasion of Poland. Well, it was a phony war initially, but anyway, and the Soviets' entry upon Operation Barbarossa. But just for the sake of the exercise, let's assume that the many atrocities that the Nazis committed were why the Allies entered the war. You'd have to believe either the Fatimids or the Seljuks were the moral equivalent of the Nazis. A statement that is so absurd that I struggle to work out where to even start with it. Like, is the jizya tax being referred to by the commenter the moral equivalent of a concentration camp? That's such a crass comparison that I'm actually kind of reluctant to publish this with the question intact. But seriously, is it? And if you think it is, I genuinely think you need to go away and reflect on what that belief means in practice. Like, what do you actually believe, honestly? And the reason the commenter and people like them will make this equivalence is because, let's be honest, there were a number of atrocities committed by the Allies during World War II that we just kind of accept as the price of dismantling the Nazis because they were so morally repugnant. Now, no one on the Allied side went to trial over these atrocities because, look, we'd won. And there was a whole thing of needing to try the actual Nazis for their crimes. Now, despite this, I think it's reasonable to say that the atrocities weren't really justified, and there seems to have been a consensus pretty quickly after, in the post-war era, that went something like, we probably shouldn't have done it in this way. Reflecting on that, even if you believe that the Crusades were motivated by a similar moral evil to Nazi Germany, that doesn't excuse the things that you do, right? Like, you still did the thing, and people still get to say, maybe you don't get to do the thing. Folks, let me ask you a question. If the Crusades were in opposition to what the commenter calls Islam invaders, it's a very eloquent person I'm responding to, by the way, and it was about Muslim administration of Christian holy sites, what year did a Muslim power take control of Jerusalem, and what year did Pope Urban II start preaching the Crusades? If your answers were around the year 638 and 1095, you're right. Well done. I'm very proud of you. But if it was the case that mere Islamic control, Islamic encroachment upon traditionally Christian territories, or Jerusalem and the Levant, if that was the issue, then why didn't the papacy or the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople or whomever preach the Crusades in 639? Why wait until 1095? And if your answer is political considerations, then good. You're completely correct. But the thing is, political considerations aren't really a justification for intervention. This goes against my political interests, so I intervened, is not really covered by the just war doctrine. Hate to break it to you folks. You can't say secular monarchs have too much power and the Byzantines losing territories to the Seljuks is inconvenient, so let's send thousands and thousands of people off to their inevitable doom in exchange for an indulgence, because that makes you sound like a cynical political operator and not like the voice of God on earth. It also means people with Space Marine avatars on YouTube would look like stupid dickheads if they tried to justify it. When you look at the Crusades with all the civilian massacres in Europe and the Levant, the sending of untrained peasants to their doom, forced conversions, the conversion of places of worship, the cynical political motivation, the cannibalism, yeah, that's right, the cannibalism. One Frankish crusader is recorded as saying, "Our men suffered from excessive hunger. I shudder to say that many, terribly tormented by the madness of starvation, cut pieces of flesh from the buttocks of Saracens laying there dead. These pieces they cooked and ate, savagely devouring the flesh while it was insufficiently roasted." And yeah, this was condemned by Catholic chroniclers because it was so disgusting to all involved. But it's still a thing that happened as a result of the Crusades. The Crusades also changed the way that Muslims and I guess like heretics and so on were considered in the eyes of the church, with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux circling the "thou shalt not kill" square for the Christian knights, declaring that, "for he bears not the sword without cause. He is the minister of God for the punishment of evil and the exaltation of good. When he kills a malefactor, it is not homicide, but, so to say, malicide." Which, you know, it's really cool. I think it's a sign that you're really justified when you invent a whole new category of, like, murder for the thing that you're doing that's technically not really murder. That sounds like the thing that a justified group of people to do. What that passage is really trying to say is that Muslims or enemies of Christ or Christianity aren't really human. A thread that I'm sure does not have consequences in the way that Crusade apologists think today and relate to contemporary issues, but also, like, when the killing of you is outside of the category of homicide, you have ceased to be human in the eyes of the people doing the killing. My point, again, in all of this isn't to say that the Crusades were the worst thing that happened in history, or that the Seljuks, Fatimids, Saladin, or Nur ad-Din, or whomever were perfect angels. My point is that the historic events we commonly understand as the Crusades, the campaigns in the Levant, as well as the other Crusades that I think we'd have an easier time acknowledging, weren't justified and aren't justifiable. None of it was justifiable, right? It's not uniquely evil. The exaggeration of atrocities or the potential to inflict atrocities has been used in modern times to justify all sorts of things. If you take the modern famous example, Saddam Hussein's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, and, you know, the fact that they didn't exist did rather put a big question mark on whether the Iraq War was justified. The fact that the purported atrocities of Muslim administrators were largely just that, right? Purported. Exaggerated, means that on that basis alone, without actually getting into that many details, we can safely say what I said in the short. No, the Crusades were not justified. Almost no event carrying that name could be. And if you're justifying them, I think you ought to think about why you're justifying them. That's a really good question that I think if you've made it this far and you're on the other end of the argument from me, go away and think about it. Just think about it a little bit. I got this far into the script and I thought, okay, why make this? The reason I just threw out a short about this originally was that I thought there was nothing really to add. That I'd write mostly this video we got up to now and then I'd be like, well, that's interesting, and just move on with my life. The thing is, it's not very interesting, and I think it would leave me a bit unsatisfied. So here's my real question. Why do some people want the Crusades to be justified or justifiable? If there's one thing I've encountered, it's very little detail and a lot of desire. The Muslims did this so we can come in and massacre the civilian population of Jerusalem. Makes me feel like a lot of the Crusade minimization and justification is about the image of glorious knights putting a city who defied them to the sword than it is about anything moral. And to some extent it feels kind of like a power fantasy, right? Like it's trad-calf power fantasy. And there's nothing wrong with a power fantasy in the context of like a video game. But when you're doing it about stuff like this, I think people get to ask a few questions about that and about you. It's also worth noting that the Crusades in the Levant were a spectacular series of failures. Yeah, the First Crusade led to the establishment of a few Crusader states, but over the long period of time that they cover, it ended with, depending on when you call the end date, the fall of Outrime? I skipped French class a lot in school. And the Mamluks being in control of the Holy Land and the Levant, all with like the Ottoman Empire in control of all of it. Both notably Islamic powers. When you're confronted with your side losing, it can be kind of hard to accept that you fought for something that sucked, because there's no like glory in valiant defeat if I was fighting just to do massacres. Like, it's just not, there's no glory in it, right? I'll also note that I want to resist saying things like sides, because the politics of the Crusades in the Levant and the Near East got really complicated at times. But I just want to say, if you're a Western European Catholic, you don't have to defend the indefensible. You don't have to make this white Europe's equivalent of the lost cause myth in America. Lost causes in America, that is people who believe the Confederacy fought for something other than slavery, like states' rights, which I would note, mostly their right to own slaves, or against tariffs, or just for some other bullshit like liberty, but notably not liberty for black people. They, at least if they have roots in the American South, have some chance of having a named ancestor who fought for the Confederacy. And I get it. I actually kind of get this more than you might think. It must be hard to have someone who could potentially share a name with you, a surname with you, and have them be known for all history as fighting for the guys who wanted to keep black people in chains. The thing is, that's what they were. And no one is blaming you personally for your great-great-great-grandfather being a piece of shit. You can choose and have the knowledge to be better. And it's weird that some tradcaths, who are mostly converts to Catholicism in my experience, and others feel the same kind of intensity about the Crusades. Unless you're from one of about 50 families, the odds of you having a named ancestor who fought in the Crusades as a white European is so small. Like, how are you going to find out who it is? And also, why do you care? What does minimizing the Crusades and maximizing the supposed atrocities of Islamic political powers allow you to do? What do you get out of it? For one, there's a reason why I've resisted as much as possible broadly painting the parties as Muslim or Christian, and that's because the Muslim world, such that that was a thing, was a geographically and politically diverse place, and so was the Christian world such that it was. Dividing along these lines obscures the fact that there were already Christians and other minority religions in the Levant, and allows you to fall into a kind of clash of civilizations narrative where there are two big, simple, incompatible civilizations that were destined for conflict, which is nonsense. It does, however, feed into the reason I wanted to go into all this. Also, my proofreader wanted me to mention the Fourth Crusade here, which famously ended in the sacking of Constantinople, the largest city in Christendom, and that kind of deserves its own video, so I'm gonna leave it alone for now. But I've encountered the argument that minimization of the Crusades plays a role in contemporary Islamophobia, and I came into this genuinely a tiny bit skeptical of that. You might imagine that a YouTuber with the Crusader in their username might not believe the word has a wholly negative connotation, and to be clear, I don't think it has a wholly negative connotation. In my username, it comes from the video game Crusader Kings 2, which is what I started out my online career streaming, and the sort of the truth of it is that I think it's kind of funny for me from a Muslim background to have that in my username. I think it's kind of funny. Look, you can agree, disagree. I think it's kind of funny. That being said, as I worked through the script and I looked at things like the designation of Muslims or enemies of the church as malefactors who you couldn't commit homicide against, it felt relevant, especially given the locations we associate with the Crusades and the ongoing existence of a settler colonial and genocidal project there. Now, there is this reading of the Crusades that says that it was an early expression of sort of European colonialism. And again, I'm skeptical. I'm not wholly there. I just think it's worth noting that that exists, but it also feels a bit like minimizing what's currently going on in that region right now. So I'm not gonna say that it's a thing, but it's definitely something to look into. Oddly, though, I was thinking about George W. Bush while I was writing this, which may seem like a weird drive-by, but I was convinced he'd said something along these lines, and I went and I found it, and this is what he said. This is a new kind of evil. And we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand, this crusade, this war on terror is going to take a while. And then it hit me. The basic, simple clash of civilizations bullshit that people buy into about the Crusades allows them to support the repression and murder of people they don't really consider people, who they perhaps consider malefactors, both at home and abroad, as has happened as a result of the war on terror. Look, a lot of people will look at that and say George W. Bush was famous for misspeaking and being a bit goofy, which, yeah, like, is an excuse if you're not in charge of the global hegemon who then goes on to essentially destroy an entire country for no reason, and also engages in a decades-long nation-building campaign where you end up getting humiliated by the Taliban. This language is also what justified the us versus them and the erosion of civil liberties that, funnily, didn't just target Muslims, but everyone. Most of the audience for this channel will have grown up or been young during the start of the War on Terror, and you might remember how hard it was to oppose a lot of the fervor, and in some ways that does reflect the very Crusades George W. Bush was referencing in his quote. I don't think that if you believe the Crusades were justified and you're just really not clued up on it, you haven't looked at it, and you're just drawing it from the ambient impression pop culture left on you, I don't believe that you're the worst person in the world. That being said, passive acceptance of this idea definitely provides a gap for some of the worst expressions of this. If you're one of those people who think, hey, the Crusades were as morally justified as fighting Nazi Germany, then I need to ask you this. What the fuck are you talking about? Why do you think that? Not the bullshit reasons that Warhammer 40k fans give. What is it that you actually want to be able to say about certain groups of people through this understanding of history? Because to me, it seems obvious that the thing that you get out of it is the same thing that Lost Causes in America got, which is an acceptable framework to launder some of your more unsavory views. The Crusades were not justified and are not justifiable. They, like so many interventions, caused a spiral of disasters that could have been avoided by people minding their own fucking business. I'm not even asking for people to say that they weren't justified if they sincerely believed that the partial accounts of people who had an interest in painting the Seljuks or the Fatimans or whoever in a certain way were that was enough to justify the reaction. All I'm saying is, this is a pattern of thinking that you would probably recognize as absurd in other people. So just, and I know I'm swinging for the fences here, just take a moment and think about whether you're about to comment about the Crusades down below because you sincerely believe that I'm off base, or you want to justify believing something else that you believe but are maybe too much of a chicken shit to say out loud. With that, I think we can safely put the issue of the Crusades to bed. There are so many things I could have gotten into, but for now the brainworm is out of my head. At last it's over. If you've made it this far and think you have something to add or argue with me about, go ahead lads, go nuts, comment section, let's do it, let's get into it. Really what I wanted to get into with that final section was that I think that the Crusades' contribution to both contemporary Islamophobia and as an early expression of European colonialism is something that I'm still thinking about it, right? Maybe it's something for another video, but I also wanted to give it the time of day, some air. Right, I already said that like the sort of European colonialism angle felt a bit crass given current events, but also I could have spoken about all sorts of things. Can war ever be justified? Is that a thing that can happen? I clearly, judging from my reaction through the video, do believe that some can be justified, but there's so much more to think about on this topic. But for me, I think I need to leave it here because otherwise I'm gonna be here all day, and I'm recording this very, at an inconvenient time, let's say. So from this malefactor, this one here, it's goodbye for now. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next video. I also need to thank my proofreader, who's my partner. She gave me a lot of good notes. I also want to thank Emir for the thumbnail. It's excellent. I really, really like the goofy knight fella. I also need to thank my patrons, especially the top tier patrons, Dronrith, Mercutio, Kazushida, who are the top tier patrons. If you want the videos early, if you want to vote on the topic of the videos, if you just want to hang out in the super secret cool bit of the Discord, well, that's what the Patreon's for. And I also want to thank our YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa and Katie Marshall, who are also eligible for those mostly the same benefits as patrons. I try and keep it as one-to-one as possible. Whether I'm succeeding or not, I will leave that to the judgment of the patrons and members themselves. But otherwise, everyone, like, subscribe, comment, all the good stuff, and I will catch you all on the next video. See ya, have a good one.